Hello, welcome to Graceway Church's Women's Sunday School or Women's Bible Study. We are starting a new 6-week series to start off the new year. We're going to be in the book Bible Studies for Life. Oh, let me get that in front of the camera. And we are dealing a 6-week study on emotions. And so every week we're going to be taking apart a different emotion and talking about it in lieu of the Bible and what the Bible says about it. But let's take a second and talk about emotions in general. We are emotional beings. We were created to be emotional beings. Even Christ as a human was a very emotional being. So it's important to understand that there's nothing wrong with emotions. There's nothing wrong with negative emotions. God created us to be emotional. The challenge comes in how we express those emotions and how we react to them. Grief, fear, anger, worry, and depression. Very normal emotions that at some time in our lives we all go through. But the question is, when we do go through these things, when we do experience these things, how do we respond? And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 6 weeks. We're starting this series with the first emotion, grief. And this starts on page 13 or 12, Walking in Grief. And the icebreaker question for this week is, what is a movie that's always made you cry? I'm not a huge movie person, and I couldn't think right off the top of my head of a movie that has often made me cry, that I've watched more than once. But I do know songs that really make me cry. An old song that actually they play every year about this time, that song Christmas Shoes, always makes me cry. And then this year in particular, Toby Mac's new song 21 about the loss of his son is something that every time I hear that song I cry. So that's for me. How about you? What movie, song, or book or story that you've heard, and no matter how many times you hear it, it always provokes grief or sorrow with you? The author says that he tends to have a soft spot and cries at dog movies. Movies like Old Yellow or Where the Red Fern Grows. And he says he rarely gets emotional on other movies, but for some reason when the dog dies, it really affects him. And a well-written story, whether it be a book, a song, or a movie, could draw us in, and we begin to care for the characters. And then when something devastating or sad happens in the movie, or something tragic, we feel a genuine sadness for that time. And then when the movie is over, our sadness tends to just evaporate just as quickly, and it just fades away as quickly as the movie fades. And then we step back into our own life stories. But here in the real world, grief is not like that. Sadness and grief does not quickly fade. It tends to just hang on. But I want us to also think, just as a side note, when we enter into eternity, that sadness and grief that was oh so real and oh so hard here on earth, well, just like the sadness we felt with a movie, it'll just evaporate and fade into nothing when we step into real life, eternal life. We all experience loss, and with that loss comes grief. If you haven't experienced it yet, just hang on, it's coming, because that's something that we all experience. And we're going to talk this week about a biblical way of dealing with that grief. We're going to be in Psalms 116. We're going to start in verses 1 through 4. You can follow along in your Bible, or it's in the Sunday School book at the top of page 15. I love the Lord because he has heard my appeal for mercy. Because he has turned his ear to me, I will call out to him as long as I live. The ropes of death were wrapped around me, and the torments of Sheol overcame me. I encountered trouble and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The writer of this psalm is experiencing some very real distress. He words it as a threat to his very existence. Exactly what has caused this kind of pain, we don't know, and we don't know what those specifics are. But he paints a very good picture so that we understand what he's facing. And he says here, very vivid image, the ropes of death were wrapped around me, and the torments of Sheol overcame me. It just pictures a picture of real distress and pain there. No one goes looking for distress or grief, but they have a way of finding us. Trouble and sorrow, like it mentions in the verse, encountered trouble and sorrow. Trouble and sorrow have a very real way of finding us, and we will experience those. So the question comes, what do we do? What do we do when grief comes? And of course, the obvious first answer to that is, to take our grief to God in prayer, to turn to Him, to lean on Him. And we can all say that so much to a point that it almost becomes a cliche. But in real life, in real practice, it's not always just as easy as, the saying makes it seem. So that brings us to the question number 2. What are some things, or what might keep us from bringing those sorrows to God and turning to lean on the Lord in the times of our real pain and distress? And there's a myriad of different reasons. There's as many different reasons as there are different people in sorrow and grief. Trust me, you can always find a reason. There's always a reason not to. But what are some of those reasons? I think one of the big ones is, and I've seen this in my own life in the past, one of the big ones is we get mad at God. We want to be spiritual and say, oh, no, not me. But the truth is, when God lets something horrible happen to us or happen to the people that we love, especially when we prayed and we begged Him not to let it happen, and He let it happen anyway. One of the emotions we feel is anger. And as we talked earlier, that's an emotion, that's a negative emotion. And the emotion in itself is not wrong. It's not wrong to be angry. It's not wrong to have grief. It's what you do with that emotion that matters. And the truth is, a lot of times we are mad at God. We don't understand, and we get angry. But we can't let that keep us from turning to God. Even if we turn to God in our anger and tell Him outright, I don't understand. I'm mad at you. How could you have done this? Why didn't you listen? Why? That's okay. Because you're going to the only person that can help. And that's the important thing. Another thing, what's another reason that we might not turn to God in our grief and in our sorrow? I think another really common one is doubt. Doubting that He is who He says He is, doubting that He cares, doubting that He's listening. And for some of us, sometimes maybe even doubting that He is there or that He exists. So, that's one of those things that can keep us from turning to Him. And we go through seasons of doubt. And like my favorite Bible verse where the man says, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. He had doubts. We pick on Thomas because doubting Thomas, walked with Jesus for 3 years, and yet he still had doubts. But the honest truth is, we all have doubts sometimes. Once again, that's an emotion. What's important is what we do with that emotion. And just like we can go to God with our anger, we can also go to God with our doubt. Turn to Him, tell Him about it, lean on Him through it. I think another thing sometimes that keeps us from going to God in our grief is a sense of guilt. Sometimes the pain that we're going through we feel like we could have done something. It's either because of something we've done or something we didn't handle right, or perhaps it really is, a mistake that we made that's caused this to happen. But whether it's a real justified sense of guilt, or if it's, just one of those imagined sense of guilt that we go through often, we could use that guilt as a reason not to go to God. Or, like the same as with the anger and the same as with the doubt, we can take that guilt and take it to God and tell God about it. He's the only one that can fix it. And the another one I thought of, and like I said, there's probably a lot I didn't think of, but another reason I thought of that things that might keep us from going to God with our grief is a feeling like, and I've been there before, it's kind of a feeling like this isn't really that bad. I shouldn't really be hurting that bad. There's so many people around that have it so much worse, and almost a feeling like I shouldn't be grieving, or I shouldn't be grieving as bad as I am. And sometimes we will let that feeling keep us from turning to God for help and turning to God for comfort through the grief. So those are some things I thought of, things that might keep us from turning to God. And I think as many as all of us are different, I think we could come up with just as many different things that could keep us from God. But as the psalmist said, in that moment when he was at the end of his rope, when the ropes of death were wrapped around me and the torments of Sheol, the grave, or even hell was wrapped around me, that's when I called upon the name of the Lord. And that's the important thing. The psalmist called upon the name of the Lord, Lord, save me. He didn't try to make it better. He didn't try to tough through it. He didn't try to figure it out on his own. He turned to God just in desperation and cried, Lord, save me. Lord, help me. And really, that's the only real thing we can do when we are overcome by grief. I don't think any of us really have the strength to get through this. To pull ourselves out of grief. You have to turn to God. You have to lean on him. That's the only way to make it through. When grief finds us, it says we can feel overwhelmed. I would say that's one of the hallmarks of grief. When grief finds you, you feel overwhelmed, out of control. And in those moments, no internal pep talk is going to suffice. It's not going to be you can talk yourself out of it and shake it off. In those moments, well-meaning individuals and the words they say isn't enough to pull you out of it, to help shake this off, to help go back to normal. Everything seems hollow or empty or meaningless. The only solution, the only way out is to call on God, to bring him the raw honesty of your emotions and your pain, and have him help you through it. So let's continue on with the psalmist in Psalm 116, and now we continue on in verses 5 through 9. Remember, we ended up the last one with him calling out in desperation to God. And then here in verse 5, the Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is compassionate. The Lord guards the inexperienced. I was helpless and he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, rescued me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. So after he was in the worst of situations and he cried out to God in desperation, he speaks here of God's compassion and grace. He knew that the psalm knew that he could call on God because he knew God's character. And I think in these verses he points out, and it's here in our book, he points out 3 big things about God's character that he can reassure himself that he can call on God, that God will help him. And the first one that he mentions there is the Lord is gracious. God is gracious. Grace is a word that we in Christian circles tend to use a lot and sometimes forget the meaning of. But the Lord is gracious. Grace is favor that you don't deserve. Favor above and beyond anything that we could ever dream of. Grace is that extra, everything you need plus more. God, by his very nature, is gracious. He will provide what you need plus some. And, often we tend to limit grace, in our eyes to either spiritual things or perhaps physical things, physical answers to prayer. But God's grace is just as real in our emotional life and in our thought processes too. And it's all about showing favor even when we don't deserve it, when there's no, if there's guilt there or if there's anger there or if you don't have to worry about it because God by his very nature is gracious. Then the second thing he points out is God is righteous. God will do what is right. He always does what is just and right. The problem with us is we are not God. We don't understand. So a lot of the things God does not seem just or right to us. It seems oh so wrong and oh so unfair. And when the grief is overwhelming us, those thoughts overwhelm us as well. But we need to remember and force ourselves to remember and act as if we believe that God is righteous. Everything he does is right and fair. Everything he allows to happen is going to, in the long run, in the picture, is going to be right and fair. And then the third thing he mentions there in that first verse, God is compassionate. We know the meaning of the word compassionate. It means that he really, really cares. He doesn't want to see you suffer. He doesn't want to see anybody suffer. He wouldn't allow the suffering to happen if there wasn't a purpose for it. It doesn't seem that way, but it's true. Earthly parents can kind of get a picture. That's here in the text here. Earthly parents can get a little bit of a picture of what this is because we kind of feel that a little bit toward our kids. We feel the compassion to want to help them, to keep them out of trouble, to rescue them, to help them. And of course, God is so much more than we are. Not only does he feel that compassion that we as parents feel for our kids, wanting to rescue our kids, wanting to make them have a better life, make them happy, successful. God's got that same feeling toward us, only magnified. And added into that, he has the perfect knowledge of knowing exactly how things are going to turn out and exactly what we need. Where we as parents, sometimes we're guessing what would be the best thing for our kids. Sometimes, to be honest, if we're going to be 100% honest, sometimes our fatigue or our own desires might keep us from always doing everything that's right for our kids. God has none of those limitations. He always does what is best and right for us. His compassion and his love far exceed any human parent's love and compassion. And that's his feelings toward us and how he wants to help us through these rough times. This brings us down to page 17 and question number 3. What are some things that have brought you healing during times of grief? I think it's different every time. I think every person's needs are different. Every grief is different. Every life situation is different. So many times you don't know what you need. You don't know what would help. Other people don't know what would help. And that makes it even more important to have God because he knows and he understands. I think one of the biggest things that helps you through grief, honestly, is time. It just takes time to deal with the pain and to get over the pain and to get to where you can function again. Sometimes you just have to wait. Sometimes you just have to, curl up in your Heavenly Father's lap and just cry it out and wait for the pain to go. And I think in the midst of all that, another thing that helps a lot is to have hope. You have to have some kind of hope that, this is going to pass. It's not always going to be this way. Things will never go back to normal. Things never go back to the way they were. Whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that happened, we have to understand things never go back to the way they were. It's always different. But it can be good again. And you have to hang on to that hope that this pain and this grief will not last forever. And no one should, this is on the bottom of page 17, no one should diminish the depth of grief that any person feels. Grief is a powerful emotion. At some point, we all experience grief, but grief is not a sin. After all, even Jesus grieved. I think there's two very good points in those couple of sentences that, bear repeating. First of all, don't diminish or judge someone else's grief. Sometimes it's tempting to say, things like, oh, well, let's just pick on the dog story at the beginning of that the man was saying he's cried about the death of a dog. Sometimes it's easy to think that, some pain is worse than some other pain, or that, this doesn't compare to that, but you cannot diminish somebody else's grief. Sometimes the loss of a dog can be a devastating blow. It can be a long, deep grief. And every person's loss it's a personal thing. It's who you are, where you are in your life, what the loss was, and what that loss meant to you. So I think we need to be very careful about, diminishing somebody else's grief and thinking, well, at least it wasn't this. And don't we sometimes, even trying to be comforting, don't we sometimes say things like, well, I'm so sorry you lost your dog, but at least your children are all okay. Yeah, and that in a way is diminishing the grief, comparing it to something else. And I think we need to be careful not to do that. The second point he made there is the point that grief is not a sin. We all hurt. We all hurt sometimes. And there's nothing wrong with hurting. Don't feel bad. Don't diminish somebody else's grief, and don't feel bad if you are feeling pain and loss yourself. And don't try to diminish your own grief by saying, I shouldn't be feeling this way. It's a real emotion. It's a real response to loss. And like it said in the passage there, even Christ experienced grief. Let's move on to page 18. We're going to skip a few verses in Psalm 116 and pick up in verse 15. The death of his faithful ones is valuable in the Lord's sight. Lord, I am indeed your servant. I am your servant, the son of your female servant. You have loosened my bonds. I will offer you thanksgiving sacrifices and call upon the name of the Lord. So the first passage we read was the psalmist talking about his grief. And then the second passage about calling out to God and why he called out to God and the character of God that made him call out to God. And now he responds in verses 15 through 17 with thanksgiving. The first verse there's been a lot of study into that. The death of a faithful one is valuable in the Lord's sight. And there's a lot of different levels to that. But for right now, let's just say that the psalmist knew that he was loved and valued by God. He was so valued that, his death to be entered into heaven, his death would be a valuable precious thing to the Lord. So and then, so that's talking about that. And then as God's servant, the psalmist decided to offer a thanksgiving sacrifice. He first went into, I'm going to serve you. I'm going to be your servant. I'm going to be your faithful, long time servant. And I'm going to respond with thankfulness just for pulling him through that period of grief. So on question number 4, what are some of the benefits of trusting and thanking God during the times of grief? Not only when you're out on the other side, but during the times of grief. Benefits of trusting and thanking him. I think the biggest one we hit on earlier is hope. If you don't have God, if you don't remember who he is and what all he's done for you in the past, and by thanking him, having that gratitude for what he's done before, what this plants in you is a sense of hope. You realize, like we just said, you are loved and valued by God. He cares. He is the type of God who is gracious and righteous and compassionate. And he loves you so much that he can't even wait. He can't wait. He's eagerly anticipating you coming home to him. And I think focusing on that, as well as focusing on all the things God has done for you in the past, gives you a sense of hope that this too shall pass, that you will make it through, that this pain and darkness and grief will not last forever. And the flip side of that is, I think those focuses also help prevent fear. So just as, you need to have hope that this is going to pass, you don't want to have the fear that, I can't make it. I won't survive this. I can't make it. I can't stand it. And really, at its heart, those statements, are fearful ones. And I think by focusing on who God is and what he's done and being thankful for him and for his love and for who he is and for what he's done for you, I think that can also help get rid of some of those feelings of fear as you're going through this. It can be hard. It can be hard to feel thankful in the midst of circumstances that cause us grief. But it's in those very moments that we need that reminder and we need that thankfulness the most. So that's a mental exercise to force yourself to remember what God has done for you and to have that gratitude. This brings us down to our final question. Question number 5. How can we as Christians be more effective in walking with one another during times of grief? So I wrote this, I answered this yesterday, and then when I got up this morning, I saw a little bit of the news, and I thought of something to add to this, so I'll add that in a minute. But I think one of the biggest ways we can help each other through times of grief is to just be there. Remember, like we said earlier, remember that everybody's loss is different. Everybody's grief is different. We can't judge, we can't diminish, we can't, but, cliches and sometimes even spiritual truths are not helpful, but our presence and our compassion often is. And then when I got to this morning, when I got up and we were reading about this bomber in downtown Nashville, and the focus of the story that I read was talking about, his life. And this was a man who lived alone, worked from home. His neighbors said they never saw anybody coming or going. He recently lost his brother and had a falling out with his mother, who was probably his only living relative. So we're talking about a man, and especially, with the pandemic and everything, we're talking about a man who was incredibly lonely. And the sorrow of that really hit me this morning, especially after I had just prepared this lesson. And I think that applies right here. How can we help one another? Just be there. Nobody was meant to go through this alone. God made us to help and support and love on each other. And we need to be there for each other. I recently was talking to a woman that was going through a period of grief. And one of the things that struck me about what she said was, even though there are people around, I feel in this grief, I feel lonely and isolated. And as I got to thinking about that, I think that's a hallmark of grief. I think grief makes us feel lonely and isolated. And I think it's during times of grief that we need each other so much more. And if you're going through the grief, reach out to others. But people who are grieving are often too weak to reach out, and we need to do our part to reach out to them. So that's my take on question number 5. How can we be more effective walking with one another during times of grief? But I'm sure there's others. I mean, so many times flowers or a meal or just some kind of gift, a card, some kind of "we're thinking of you" thing can really help. And also more practical things like, to do childcare or pay a bill, or something more practical to keep people from struggling with additional struggles and on top of the grief. There's many ways, and I'm sure you all have your favorite ways, but that we can be there for each other and help each other through these periods. So let's turn to page 20 and do this final page. The summary at the end, they always put there about live it out, practical ways to apply this lesson to our life. And the first one they're talking about is pray. And he's wrote, if you're in a season of grief or sorrow, pray. Talk to God about what your experience or feeling. Very good, very important. Let's add to that. But if you are not in a period of grief and sorrow, pray. Pray for those who are. Because any of us have people around us that are suffering and hurting at any given time. Pray. And then number 2, list. Make a list of all the ways God has shown you grace and compassion. When difficulties arise, pull out that list. For those of you who keep a prayer journal, I've always heard it's a good idea to put, like anytime you write a prayer, to leave a space so that you can put later on God's answer to that prayer. And that's a good format. I did that for a few years, but it's also just a good format to just write down whenever you have an answer to prayer, whether it's your prayer or somebody else's prayer. Just put it down in black and white. God did this. And then when you're feeling overwhelmed by the grief, you've got something you go pull out and say, God is good. Look what he's done. Look how he's helped in the past. But if you don't have that list already printed out, just because you're in the grief now doesn't mean that you can't make the list. It's a little bit harder when you're hurting, but you can still go back and you can still remember how God has helped you through things in the past, what God has done for you in the past, and write it down in black and white so you can see it in front of you. Then he says, number 3, listen. If you have a friend or relative going through grief, invest the time to sit with them. Just listen. You don't have to try to fix the problem. You don't have to offer advice. Just be there. Just listen. Just be there. And the truth is, in our society, often our time is our most precious commodity. For every minute we have 10 places it can go, 10 things we could be doing at any given time, and our time is a very precious commodity. We need to make the time for people who are hurting. We need to, Christ is our example. he was there for the people who are grieving and hurting and helping the people who needed his help. And we need to make time for one another, especially during times of grief. I mean, all the time. We need to stay, like Pastor's been saying in his Connected series, we need to stay connected. And I think, especially during times of grief, we need to stay connected. We need each other. God made Christian people as one body, one unity, one body under him for a reason. We need each other, and we need to remember that we need each other. And I mean, Pastor had an excellent sermon this morning about, the communion and how we need to be as one. And just because it's harder now is not an excuse. We need to pull together and be there for each other. Thank you so much for starting out this new series in this new year with me. And we are going to be back next week talking about the emotion of fear and how to deal with that. And we'll see you then.